Today I'm speaking with Ian Waters, CTO of Cavalry. This is a really fascinating and quite technical conversation about designing motion tools. Cavalry is a relatively young motion design tool with a really talented team, and to be building a new motion tool at this time, to me at least, is really interesting. The thing is, motion design is still quite young, but it's a paradigm that's intimately woven with the abilities of the software that you use to design it. You could argue that After Effects, the main motion tool that everyone knows about, has been around since before motion was even a thing. So it was originally designed for something slightly different to the way that it's used today, and it's kind of tried to keep up and evolve. There are some issues that we get into there, and you may already know about it if you're a motion designer. But what if you could start again? What if you could design a motion tool from scratch based on the way that motion is done today? Well, that's exactly what Cavalry are doing, and it's a fascinating conversation about how to re-engineer and think about all of that from the ground up. I found it really interesting. I learned a ton about conceptual design, the technology that actually lives behind motion tools that we use every day, and much, much more. As sometimes happens, my camera had some quality issues. Again, ridiculous, I know, but I've got it sorted now. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Ian Waters from Cavalry. So I would love to start at a higher level, and then we can dive into some of the history of Cavalry. What does it take to make a new motion design tool? Or let's dive a bit deeper than that. What does a motion design tool need to do? Or maybe even deeper than that, what does a new motion design tool need to do in this huge landscape of tools that are out there? And how did you think about all of that at the beginning?
Yeah, so it's I mean, being a motion graphics artist these days can mean anything, right? You do everything from 3D character animation and simulations and all that kind of stuff, right down to text animation and data-driven things, and it's enormous. The industry is so wide now that being a motion graphics artist can be anything. I mean, even UI animation and things now comes under the umbrella. So yeah, where do you start? So we basically had issues that we saw in our studio. So the things that we were dealing with day to day, and we thought there was a better way of dealing with that stuff. I mean, but you can't start with a limitless scope, right? So you have to start somewhere. You can't take everything on, so you have to limit yourself. And we limited ourselves with kind of 2D data text. We kind of like gave ourselves that as the kind of like the verticals that we would go for. We've expanded that since, so we cover 2.5D with cameras and things, and we didn't have that to begin with. So yeah, we have expanded that. But yeah, at the beginning we needed Rails, and we just started from there. So we started with looking at building so Cavalry was built around a way of working. So we didn't have a list of features. We didn't have a technology that we wanted to exploit. So some startups start with a technology. They have a cool technology. Like, is that AI? Is that like a Figma? It was a really cool mesh system. Or like whatever that is. We didn't start with a technology. We started with a way of working, and then we kind of went from there. Like, what technology do we need to enable this way of working? And so we created an engine, and then we built kind of concepts on top of that engine, ideas on top of that engine, and that's how it all got started.
Right. Yeah, and on the School of Motion interview, you mentioned this a couple of times about a way of working, and I love that way of thinking because that precedes design as well, and that obviously precedes any kind of platform that you build. There was a really lovely quote in that or sort of piece of info that you shared in that interview as well, which was that before you started, was it the first 6 weeks or something like that, or something like that? You
Mm-hmm.
had just a design kind of brainstorm slash way of working kind of session with each other, and it was passed by so quickly in the interview, and I really wanted to
Yeah.
dig into like what were all the things that you covered there. Like it, I just when Cavalry came about, I was just really inspired by this thing. It's like if I could start again with After Effects, or if you could, you know, it's really inspiring that you are in a position to do this, and I would love to dive into all the decisions that were thought about, or as many as you want to discuss.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I was working with an engineer called Martin, very talented software architect, and I kind of laid out how I wanted workflows to work in the app, and then he spent his time looking at how to build an engine, so the technical kind of architecture for enabling that way of working. What we ended up
Can I
with was
just
something.
interrupt as well and ask,
Yeah,
how did
yeah.
you, I want to go even deeper if possible, but you don't have to say it right now, but like, how did you even lay that out for him? Like, how did you write out the workflows? Was it just conversations, or did you draw stuff? Like,
We were drawing stuff. So he had an iPad with a pencil, which I was very jealous of, and so got one. And we used to just pass it backwards and forward. We sat next to each other, so he was on my left, and we would. He had an infinite canvas app at the time. I can't remember what it was. I mean, now you could use Freeform or something, but he would just draw. He would draw boxes, lines between them, and we would literally talk about. So we want the user to be able to do this and then this with these three building blocks. How on earth can we calculate that? Because we're programmers as well as designers, and we couldn't work it out. We were stuck, right? And so we were aware that there was another piece of software that could do what we were trying to do in 3D, and that's Houdini. And so we watched a YouTube video on his iMac, and we were looking at how the work was set out so that you could do X, Y, Z, and then we were thinking the representation that you can see, because they show you a node graph in Houdini, right? The representation that you can see, that is not what's happening to the data. It isn't, because when we were drawing it out, there's something going. Where an arrow's pointing one way, there's something going two ways here. And so we thought, or they're not showing you everything, right? So we thought, okay, let's try and come up with a system where information can travel. There's this thing called a dependency graph, where you have kind of blocks laid out and information passes in one direction through the graph. And when something changes, then you calculate everything on the left side of that graph, right? So I know this is very technical, but that's basically how dependency graphs work. Yeah, and we needed basically things to go in two directions on that graph. So we needed to be able to send some information backwards and then get the result of that data, and we need to be able to do that several times during the same kind of calculation loop. And this gave us this amazing way of working in Cavalry, which is how we wanted to do things. So, for example, in Cavalry, if you create a circle and then you give it a random color, and then you put that circle into a duplicator so that you end up with 9 circles, each one of those circles will have a different color, and you've done nothing. You've assigned one random color. We're automatically getting 9 for you, and that's due to this kind of like this sending information backwards through the graph. And this information in this instance that we're sending backwards through the graph is a seed value for all of these different shapes in a duplicator, and this enabled this great way of working where we could reuse the same components in the app, the same concepts. I'll use this word again and again and again, concepts, because Cavalry is all based on this conceptual design. And we use these same concepts again and again. So you can assign a random color with say a random behavior, and then if you want a random color in a cloner duplicator in Cavalry, that's the same idea, right? So this kind of crazy, clever technical solution that was based on the way of working enabled what became Cavalry effectively. And it means that you keep coming across the same features again and again. So in different workflows, you keep coming across the same thing, which means that the learning curve for the app is shallower. Now, we can get into later on, the learning curve, because we can plot the learning curve for Cavalry, which is really fascinating. We can get into that topic later on. But it's really interesting how it all came about. But yeah, so the 6 weeks, Martin was doing that. And while he was doing that, I was developing the conceptual design for the app. So the idea. So we need a concept of noise, we need a concept of random, we need a concept of time, this kind of thing. So I was coming up with these things, and even at a more UI level, I guess a surface level, things like animation layers and just all of these things. And then we built out that block, and that block was there to service the verticals we were going into. So data and text. And
when you say block,
keyframe animation.
I'm slightly not following there. What do you mean by block?
So these features, these ideas in the app. So like a shape, a piece of text,
I see. Of course. Sorry, I was thinking of block for all of the things you just mentioned. Each is like a modular kind of thing. I get it.
Yes, exactly. So Cavalry is built in an incredibly modular way, and because of the nature of the way that it's built. So again, behind the scenes, it's all nodes, but we show you a stack, we show you a layer stack. So it's a little bit like 3D Studio Max in that way, that you get this modifier stack, but really behind the scenes, it's something else. And that gives us the ability to build Cavalry up sideways without increasing the learning curve too much. Basically, because you've seen everything before, you know exactly what a slider looks like and all that kind of thing. The interface is all the same. So it helps us to add features without increasing the learning curve too much. So
that is really interesting. So yeah, I've written about 7 questions that I want to ask about things you've said there. This will be a theme here, um, for me as I go through the interview. There's so much interesting stuff. I think probably I'd love to stay high level at the moment and just something as you were talking and as I've heard you speak before that struck me is you're a developer, you write code, you're a designer, you're a motion designer, you're in these 3 areas. Like there's a term expressiveness that people sometimes use for how like flexible a program is, and obviously code is like one of the most expressive paradigms. You can kind of do anything. It's very
Hmm.
like kind of what you were talking about there. How does that resonate in any way? Like when I use Cavalry versus After Effects, it reminds me a little bit of kind of like the extensiveness of writing code. You can kind of go in any direction that you want. Does it feel like that to you, or does it feel limited compared to when you actually you write code?
So yeah, I mean, this is an interesting technical topic in itself, actually, because let's go back to just to mention Houdini again. They spent a lot of effort making the way that their software works, making that Turing complete, which means that you can basically program anything. You could program like Snake or whatever you wanted to do in Houdini, and Cavalry isn't quite that open. So Cavalry is, it's open-ended creativity. We like to say that a lot, and you can do lots of things by kind of hand in there. You can create design systems really, really effectively. It isn't complete yet. Like we haven't finished our feature set. It's not done. We're still on that journey. But for a lot of, I mean, for a lot of use cases, yeah, we have like allow you to be fully expressive and in ways that is kind of automated. So we take a lot of the kind of duplication of tasks and the kind of the repeated workflows. And because Cavalry is procedural, and just to hammer home what proceduralism means, it means that what you're doing is a recipe. You are creating a recipe, and then you're just rerunning that constantly. So it's like kind of you're creating a description for how your scene should look, and then we rerun that description and that show that to you on screen. So as opposed to something like Photoshop, where if you blur an image and then you do something else with that image, like you kind of erase part of it or whatever, you can't go back and change the blur amount because it's baked into the image, kind of thing like that. So that's not procedural, whereas Cavalry is fully. So you can change anything that you've done along the way at any point, which is the benefit of this, which speeds up changes, that kind of iterative workflow, which is something that you see a lot in 3D, but you don't see a lot in 2D. So that's one of the many things that we wanted to do is to bring kind of this 3D way of working, these innovations that you see in the 3D space into the 2D space, because we felt it was pretty neglected.
Right. Just to clarify that for people who haven't used Cavalry, um, in Photoshop and After Effects, you have layers and you can remove layers, and it's non-destructive in that respect. So maybe you could go in a little bit more depth about what you mean by procedural
Yeah,
in Cavalry.
yeah, so, sure. So work when you're working in so After Effects actually does have something in common with the way of working in Cavalry, in that you have an effect that's a blur and you can change that blur afterwards, because that blur isn't baked into something. It's an effect that's on top of it, although you can only use that blur on that one layer. So you in Cavalry, a blur is a separate thing in the stack, so you can connect it to many things at once, rather than having to manage several blurs or whatever. You can use the same one in Cavalry. But in Photoshop, if you blur a layer, those pixels are baked in. And then if you then do something else, you can go back in the undo history. You can go backwards like four or five steps to where you did the blur, redo the blur, then redo your other steps to get back to where you were. But you can't go back and just change the blur while keeping your other changes. There you go. There's a nice reaction. But yeah, that's I should have turned those off. But yeah, that's the difference, really. It's kind of, instead of your changes being baked in, you are just describing how you want your scene to look, and then we will execute the entire chain of operations every time you want to see something on the screen.
Nice. Okay, cool. Fascinating. So just staying in the realm of like the early days and when you were designing this, I'm interested where you drew inspiration from. You mentioned Houdini, maybe you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned something else. I'm presuming you guys use Figma and all modern tools like that. Like, have you drawn from other inspirations outside of the motion world?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, I'm just someone who reads lots of papers, as in like user interface design, kind of academic papers, and all the SIGGRAPH papers and things like this. I tend to read a lot of that stuff, and I definitely get ideas from there. We used to develop software for Maya, so I worked on Maya for about 3.5 years. It's contracted on that, and taking ideas that I learned from working there, and I don't really use Figma very much. It's not I'm not brilliant at graphic design. So Chris, one of our business partners, he takes care of the Figma stuff, the visual design side of things. I'm much earlier in the process is where I sit. So coming up with the ideas of the software, how that will work, and then the implementation of that stuff, the information architecture, all of that kind of thing. All the Cavalry is very much designed from the bottom up, rather than the top down. So we don't do screen first. So screen first would be top down design, and we're very much from the bottom up. On that front.
Right. And can you dig into that a little bit more? Maybe you can speak to the early days of designing the platform from the ground up. Like, talk a little bit about that for someone who's more used to the other way.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So, Cavalry uses this thing called conceptual design, and this title has been retrofitted. So I used to do this conceptual design thing years ago, and so conceptual models, conceptual design has been around for like a long time, and it's a way of so let's talk about what a concept is. So a concept is it's an object, an outcome, an action. So it's the thing that defines relationships in your app. So let's take an idea. Let's say in Cavalry we have thousands of concepts. One concept is a keyframe. A keyframe has a couple of states. It has time and value. In Cavalry it has a color. It has an interpolation type. So is it linear? Is it step? Whatever. So those are the states. So Cavalry has there are actions for a keyframe. So you can add, remove, you can move, you can duplicate, you can set the color. So these are all the actions you can do on it. And in Cavalry we call it a keyframe. So this could be a concept, and concepts can go further. So you can say if there are accessibility considerations. So and there are like safety misuse considerations. And then what you have is related concepts. So in Cavalry, a related concept to a keyframe is what we call a key bar. Now, this is the line that goes between two keyframes, which you can use to move multiple keyframes at once, which you can use to delete animation channels. It shows you where animation starts and ends on a layer. And in Cavalry, if a key bar is dashed, that means the value is staying the same. So in the time editor, if you see two keyframes with a dashed line between them, that means that the value is not changing. So that's the concept of a keyframe. Cavalry has lots and lots of these concepts. And what's really important about having conceptual design is that you come up with, you note related concepts as you are writing them. Okay. So for example, let's take categories and labels in Gmail, which are effectively the same concept, right? So same outcome, but different implementations of the same idea. And this is so one of the in your list of things to talk about, there was a line saying books. I have a book here which talks about this in great detail, which I can show you later. But the idea here is that basically you can, instead of adding a second feature which effectively does the same thing, categorizes your emails, you could expand one feature rather than having two. So it makes your software easy to learn if you expand a feature rather than adding a second one that effectively overlaps enormously. So I would say that Gmail did it wrong there. Someone who did it right would be Apple. So Apple had labels in their Finder where you could change the color of a file and say everything that's in progress you could label like orange, and everything that was done you could label green. And Apple wanted you to be able to name these labels, and they wanted you to be able to have multiple labels because they were exclusive before. And so what they did was they changed labels and they made it so that they were non-exclusive and that you could rename them. And they called them tags. So they basically updated the same feature to be something else rather than adding a second tag feature, which kind of overlapped with labels. So Apple did that right. I think that Gmail did that wrong in that instance. There's other examples of this, like we used to use GitLab, which had exactly the same problem. They had two concepts for labels, the same thing basically. So you create these things, and these things called concepts. You have a whole stack of them, and when you're adding a new one and you go look at the related concepts, you can basically think, oh, we've got something that's the same as this. Let's just expand that one that does a similar kind of thing. And that way you can kind of resolve hidden dependencies. You can resolve things that are duplications, before you get there, before you implement them, and then someone else points it out to you that actually this is really similar to this. Why have you got this twice? Hidden dependencies is another really important thing here. You can resolve hidden dependencies. So really, really interesting to me is this idea where in a Photos app, say you have two albums in a Photos app, and you add the same photo to two albums, right? One of the albums is called Instagram and one of them is called Facebook. So you want them, one to be cropped square, you want one to be cropped landscape. So you go into the Instagram photo and you change that to be a square crop. Has the photo in the other album changed? Is there a hidden dependency there? So I change it in one place, has it changed in another place? So you don't know, right? And this this idea of things happening that you can't see or you might not expect. Well, it's different in every Photos app, right? So it's different in Lightroom, it was different in Aperture, it's different in Apple Photos. Everyone does it differently, and making these things explicit. This is another thing that you can see from doing a conceptual design, basically. So other important things about conceptual design is it basically forms a basis for documentation because it has all the states, all the actions, all the desired outcomes, and an introduction. So it basically codifies all of that stuff. So your documentation can come from it, your testing can come from it because of the things that you're expected to be able to do with the concept are in there, right? And then it also forms a common vocabulary, so everyone knows what something's called. So in Cavalry, there's a concept called a behavior, which is basically something that it's like an effector in Cinema 4D, I guess you could call it. So we call them behaviors. We stole the word from motion, but basically that's a concept, and so everyone knows that that's called a behavior because it's codified in that conceptual design. So now we're a small team, so this is very ad hoc. I don't go back and update these things when I change them all the time. I just don't have time to do it. But it really helps to when we're adding something new, and especially with the other developers, I always have them create concepts for the new features that they're adding, just so that they can get it clear in their head what they're building, what the outcomes are that they want to build, and it really helps the developers to get that sorted. Because the developers also do the design work for us because we're very small.
Could you walk us through like a super high level 101 of how you would do one of those for, I don't know, an example feature?
Yes. Yeah. So we have we use Miro for this. So we've got a Miro board, which has basically just got these concepts on. I really wish there was a piece of software specifically for dealing with this stuff. Maybe you can bend Notion into doing it. You could tell me that, but basically it's a template that we have there that has this list of things. So like the concept, which would be the description, the name of it and the description, purpose, states, example use cases, actions, then any accessibility considerations, safety misuse considerations, and notes. Really important to include in the notes any rejected design ideas, because someone could think later, why didn't we do this? And if you go and look at the notes, we haven't done this because it doesn't work with this other idea or whatever, that kind of thing. And then the related concepts. So this is related to this, that. And then they take this template and fill it out. That's it. So it's just words. You take it, you fill it out with the different states. So like I said, for a keyframe, it would be time, value, color. And it's really important that the things that they put in the concept are only the things that the user should be aware of. So a concept is a user-facing thing. It's not an internal developer thing. So the developer model of what the software is guided by what the user should see. So that's basically just an implementation detail, and we keep that away from the design. So you're like how the developer implements this concept is up to them. But the design of the thing that is user facing, that's the concept. So if it isn't in the conceptual model, a user shouldn't really be aware of it, which is we can get into trouble with that stuff because things can leak. Which has happened a couple of times in Cavalry, which affects the learning curve a little bit. Again, we can get into that later. But we try our hardest, but it's not it's not perfect because we're not perfect.
You're not perfect? That's terrible. I can't believe you're not perfect. Yeah, that's fascinating. So you have your own like internal sort of light documentation, effectively, about every one of these concepts. And how many did you say there were?
Yeah, so there are hundreds. So there are hundreds, and we don't have a codified way of like sharing these things, so they don't exist, for example, on our workspace, and we literally share them by sending files to each other. It's really bad, but they don't exist for everything. Like sometimes a user will ask for a feature, and I'll just I'll add that, and it'll go in, and you can go back and retrofit these things afterwards and change it when you get time to update these things. But we basically do. We have hundreds of files that basically codify what users are aware of in the app.
Interesting. And is there any kind of hierarchy there that's documented, like where you have like concepts within concepts, or is it just all sort of?
Yeah, so that is something that exists in the framework. It's a brilliant question, by the way. That is something that exists in the framework. So what's he called? Daniel Jackson. So Daniel Jackson's the guy who kind of codified this way of working, and he codified that like a few years ago, and we changed what we were doing, which was similar to what he said, but he kind of gave it more of a concrete framework. And he talks about like parent concepts and child concepts and that kind of thing, but we don't do that. But yes, if we had time, it's more the thing is, it's more process. We tend to be very process light because of how small a team we are.
I mean, as in like, if you were looking at Cavalry, you as the CTO, Like, surely there are hierarchies there in your head, at least, of concepts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And we abuse the related concepts for that. So, a animation channel would definitely be a parent concept for keyframes and key bars and things like that. So, that definitely exists in my head, and yeah, it should exist in the layout of these things. But I literally I wrote myself a piece of software using Swift UI, which manages the concepts and things. But I'm the only one who can edit the app, because I don't know anything about collaborative working and all that kind of stuff, which is, if we were to put this on a web server or something like that, it's not what I know about. So I can't, but one day maybe someone will create this software. But yeah, at the moment I've got an app, but everyone else just does it in Miro, text editor, whatever. It's fine.
I wonder if you could do it in Cavalry. Who knows?
Maybe. Well, with spreadsheets and things, you probably
Yeah.
could, right? You could, hook it all up to, that could work.
So just maybe we could step outside of this and look at it from a different angle, just to dive a little bit deeper in another way, which is this idea of conceptual design with, I guess you'd call it technical debt, or like a huge program that's been established, and you know which one I'm going to pick, which is After Effects. Like, how do you think people who say, there are people, you probably know them, who are in After Effects today, who have the same like appetite for this kind of way of thinking about software, but they're working on After Effects, how does that interact with a platform that's really old and established in lots of ways? Like, how do you rebuild or re-engineer? I don't know whether that sparks any I don't really have a strong question there, but like, have you worked on any projects or products which are really sort of established, and how do you attack this if it's not there already?
Yeah, so I've worked on Maya for a few years. I think in total, it was 3.5 years I was working on Maya, and I worked on their 3D type tool. So they had a type tool, 3D type tool, and it needed replacing. And I designed a new type tool, and then with the help of another developer, a contract developer, replaced that tool. And that was really the only way to do it. There's an engine there basically in Maya, and you have to work within the confines of that engine. And so it's tricky, because you can create a product that's as good as it can possibly be for that engine, for the technical limitations basically. But that's as far as you can go. And ultimately, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to build Cavalry, is because we wanted to do something in Maya, and the engine wouldn't let us do it. We couldn't work out how to trick the engine into doing it. It wasn't really possible. And so this is one of the ideas that we bundled into Cavalry, because we couldn't work the way we wanted to work, that we were restricted by that technical debt, right? So I worked on Bifrost, which was much newer. I worked 6 months on their UX team, and we were looking at they're looking at a kind of replacing that architecture in Maya with a more open-ended coding-like way of constructing scenes. And so that was much freer. And we probably could have done what we wanted to do there, but it was just years away from being ready. It's a long term project. Like rebuilding an app, re-architecting an app, it takes a long time. And one of the things that's really hard to shed is if you have kind of archaic, terrible data structures that were that were created due to restrictions in memory or processing speed or whatever, that don't exist anymore. You can be stuck with that stuff. I mean, so it might not be able to change that because of the way that save files work and all that kind of stuff. So you have to be really careful about that kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So before we move on,
it's hard.
Yeah. Before we move on to some of the technical side of it, or the platform, I'd love to just tie off the conceptual design stuff with maybe you could just talk about 2 or 3 of the kind of conceptual designs that you feel most proud of in Cavalry, that not necessarily for others or new people, but that sets it apart in your mind from the established way of doing motion. Like you mentioned the key bar, like that one stood out to me immediately.
Yeah, so that's a pretty fun one. I will say, so just before I do that, I will say that if you don't create a conceptual design for your app, like a mental model, if you don't create a conceptual design for your app, if you don't codify it, you're going to have one anyway. Right, because you can't have an app without ideas, concepts, all that kind of thing. So codify. So if a designer does not tell you what this concept is, all of that stuff, then it's going to happen by accident. Basically, a developer is going to assume what those states are, or anything that isn't kind of like dictated. So you're going to have one anyway. So this is a way to kind of maintain control as a designer over what gets made. Okay, so another concept that I really like in Cavalry is our render queue. So the render queue in Cavalry is interesting, especially if you're an After Effects user, in that our render queue items hang around. And what's magical about that is that you can make connections into and out of render queue items, which means that the same render queue item can render your scene multiple times, and each time it renders your scene again, we can change the value, and that value changing can iterate a spreadsheet, or it can change a random seed, or it can change anything. Basically, it can move to a different line in an array. It can change the comp resolution. It can change the length of the comp. It can do all sorts, right? So that's really, really powerful. And all we're doing there is creating this concept that has a state, right? And the state is the I need to open Cavalry. Oh, it's here. It's called the render index, the render queue index. Let me just look at that. It's called the dynamic index. Sorry, that's embarrassing. And you can hook that into everything. So that's the state on that concept, and just by adding that single state, it enables like 1,000 different workflows. So that's a really elegant, simple solution. You set the number of renders, you set the dynamic count, the dynamic index, and that's it. So two things to do, and you've opened up a whole new world of possibilities, basically.
Interesting, fascinating. Okay, thank you. So maybe we move to the platform and the actual not the architecture, but the building of it, again from a semi-technical perspective, but not a true engineer perspective. Like, what is a render engine for for people who haven't thought about this before? And where do you start? And if it's 2D at the beginning, if one day you might go to 2.5D, if you might go to 3D one day, if you might have an API, you mentioned on the podcast as well, I think. I'm right, and you said that you were quite lucky in the way that you thought about it in the beginning and where Cavalry went in the end. And this just strikes me as a really, really hard thing to do in the beginning. Like, if you've got this kind of pyramid-like shape of these are the most important decisions here, but we're nowhere close to product market fit, or maybe we have a few users or whatever. Like, how do you make those decisions there about something so fundamental? And have you had to roll back anything as well?
We haven't. So again, from the engine's point of view, the engine can calculate anything. So what's great about our engine is that it's very because it's effectively just executing these building blocks. And if we need a new building block, we can just add it and it will just calculate it. And so in terms of building Cavalry out, there are no issues there. So where it comes, in terms of building the platform, we have layers of architecture in Cavalry. So the engine's near the bottom. So the bottom would be our data types. So a data type would be how we store something, basically, and the data types get serialized, so the data types get turned into JSON. Our file format is JSON, so they get turned into JSON and then written to a file. So that's the bottom. That's the bottom. The data types, and then we've got the engine sitting on top of that, and then on top of that we have something that expands on the engine. We use plugins for this, so we built Cavalry with plugins in mind, because I was a plugin developer for Maya. I'm a big fan of allowing developers to have access to your tools, just not for table stakes basic stuff. We should be providing all of the basic motion graphics tools, but if they want to kind of add a vertical to the things that we can do, then that's amazing. Or make something easier that some, not a fad is the wrong way, but some technique that is quite cumbersome to create. They can make tools that make that easier, and we're really happy about that. So we created this extension layer on top of our engine where we can put plugins in ourselves, because we wanted to eat our own dog food. Is that the phrase? Where we kind of wanted to make sure that this kind of plugins would work in Cavalry. So we have plugins, and then on top of this we have the GUI layer, so the user interface layer, and the user interface layer contains things like our tools. Right, so our tools would be the drawing tools that you have in the side there. So we have a set of kind of those, and inside this GUI layer we also have things like the time editor and the graph editor, the viewport. So the viewport's interesting is that it's right at the very top, and it goes all the way through to the very bottom with the data types. So the viewport is the thing that kind of spans. It's the kind of the structure that holds everything up, and the viewport is the rendering engine. We we being a small startup in the north of England, we didn't have kind of American VC money, so we kind of built everything else, and then we attached an existing viewport to it. So we use Google's Skia, which is an exceptional piece of technology that gives us kind of all of our drawing abilities. And Skia has its own shading language, so we can make our own custom shaders and things and filters and all that kind of stuff. It's really, really brilliant. And so we use that rendering engine. So it was kind of like we sellotaped that on, we attached it. Actually, so that doesn't do it justice. It's kind of built through the way that we do everything Skia. So it's kind of like it's very well integrated into what we do. And yeah, so that's kind of how we did it. That's the layers of it, and then the viewport kind of like with the render engine goes all the way through. And then so if we want to add 3D later on. Well, Cavalry was designed with 3D in mind. I actually wanted Cavalry 1 to have 3D, or 2.5D, I should say, 3D transforms. But we couldn't get there in time. Everything always takes longer than you think. And so we built it with that in mind. So Cavalry uses Cartesian coordinates, and that means that 0, 0 is in the middle of the window. So if you set something to 0, 0, it's in the center, like in 3D. So in 3D, it's in the middle when it's 0, 0. And that means that when you turn something into 3D, we can just use the same coordinate system, so you don't end up with two sets of coordinates like you do in After Effects, top left and then the 3D space. And that's just an advantage of us thinking about that from the beginning, because I just knew that we wanted to go in that direction. So when we wrote the first lines of code for the viewport, we had a conversion that went from top left to the center, because top left is natural for 2D graphics, basically. And so we have this conversion right at the very beginning, and that's how we were able to have this, which meant that adding 2.5D to Cavalry was really easy. So 2.5, I say really easy, it was obviously a huge project, but it was much easier. From a user point of view, we swallowed all the complexity. So from a user point of view, you just turn on 3D and you get an extra box, Z translation, so it's very, very elegant from a user's point of view. And the whole moving to 3D thing doesn't mean changing our render engine or anything, because it's just math. 2.5D is faked. It's all just maths, skewing, rotation, scale, and then it's we do depth sorting. We do our own depth sorting. So it's like bring your own depth sorting. So we have structures and things that work out what should be in front of what, and then we just render them in that order. So it's not like proper 3D where you do culling and all that kind of thing. So
right, okay,
it's all cheated. It's a really cool technique, actually. So it's a really cool technique invented by someone at Apple in the late 1980s. It was a quick draw 3D. It was a really brilliant idea for faking 3D transforms, making something look 3D by abusing skew, rotation, and scale effectively to make things look 3D. Nothing's actually 3D in Cavalry; it's all faked. It's just I mean, I think that used to be how it was in After Effects, and I think After Effects is now properly 3D. I think they've got a real 3D renderer in there now, which is great. It's a huge task they've got ahead of them there, but fantastic to see.
Yeah. Maybe you could just dive into that again, trying to make it as accessible as possible for people, asking for a friend here. Like, what is the difference between 2.5D and 3D from a kind of technical perspective? Like, in cinema, you have the viewport where it's like clearly 3D. In After Effects, you used to have just this sort of 2.5D in Cavalry. And then you've got this third layer, which is like the render engine. Like, in cinema, you can bring in something like Redshift, or now that's pretty much the same thing now. Like, what are those three things? 2.5, sort of After Effects, new 3D, and then Redshift. Like, maybe you could place those for us a bit.
Okay, so 2.5D is fake. So 2.5D is just us manipulating the shape of something to look like it's 3D and then rendering it in the correct order. So it's basically an optical illusion. 2.5D is an optical illusion. Okay, so that's how that works. So nothing has a Z coordinate in the render engine. So once it gets to the render engine, there is no Z coordinate for anything. So I mean Z as in going back in space. I know that's different depending on what which 3D app you're using. But in 3D, obviously, a polygon has X, Y, Z coordinates for each vertex on that polygon. And so that render engine will use that. And then, when you get two polygons next to each other, you can smooth the shading between those two things using whatever technique is used these days. I'll be a little bit out of touch with that kind of thing. When I first got started, it was Phong shading, and now obviously we're using ray tracing and all that kind of stuff. But in 3D, a polygon has a third dimension. In Cavalry, there is no third dimension. It's, like I say, it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all faked, which means that we can do this, this stuff more quickly, because there's no like third coordinate, which drastically increases the computational cost of doing all these kind of all the maths involved, basically. But one downside, the big downside of 2.5D is you don't. It's not easy to do intersections. So if I have a plane this way and I have a plane this way, and you want them to kind of like intersect to make a kind of a cross shape, you can't really do that in 2.5D. You basically end up with something that doesn't look right, and that's the problem with 2.5D, with it being smoke and mirrors and things. So it is, I think it is, with a lot of work, possible to work around that by splitting planes and all that kind of stuff, but we're not there yet. But that's the downside of 2.5D. The benefit of it is that it's possible, which is why we did it, because it gives us cameras, and cameras are so important to animation. You know, being able to just drift, or adding a bit of just moving through your layers and things. It adds such a lot to work just to add the smallest camera move to something. It really does enrich the animation. So that's why we added it. The main reason was to get cameras. Even though, so there are downsides like not being able to do intersections or not being able to import a 3D model from an external source. It still adds an awful lot. And to be honest, if we did go 3D, you've got to compete with, Maya, Cinema 4D, whatever, everything that they do amazingly. Because, if we had, look, you can import models into Cavalry and you can use photorealistic textures on it and all that kind of thing. What happens if a client says, okay, make it furry? We don't have a fur feature or whatever. So what are you supposed to do? You need to go back and do it again in the 3D app. So it's a big job if we ever went in that direction.
Right. Okay. And that's obviously where the render engines like Redshift or whatever come in, and they have there's a whole
exactly. Yeah, they'll do the the unfolding and all that kind of thing. I don't miss UVs. I really don't. Interestingly, we're working with them at Cavalry in the moment. We're working on a mesh feature where you can turn a shape into a mesh, like a flag or whatever, and you can wave that with the texture sticking to it properly. And it's working with UVs again for the first time since I was in 3D, and I do not miss it. I really wish that Pixar's PTEX had taken over and was more accessible.
So I'd love to go back to, again, the early days of when you were designing Cavalry in the beginning and how you really thought about the UI, like how you design a new motion tool from scratch. What are you showing people? You've got this kind of timeline element. You've obviously got the viewport, but there are other things that are in there. What was some of the considerations that you thought about then, and how did you iterate on that design?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and there's actually a lot of science here. So we know about the way that you go about designing user interfaces and the way that you can use an app when it is non-linear and open-ended. So Cavalry is non-linear and open-ended in that we don't know where someone's going to enter a workflow. Is it half done already? Are they taking the work off someone else? We don't know whether they're going to exit a workflow. Is it because they've done the work? Is it because they've run out of time? Is it because there's a skills gap? They don't know how to finish the work? Is it because we lack a feature? We don't know where they're going to exit. And we don't know how they're going to get there. So we can't say that in order to get text that does X, Y, Z in Cavalry, you use this workflow, because we've got lots of ways of doing the same thing. And that's really important as well, because like I say, the way that you design an app for professional users is very different. It's a completely distinct set of kind of UI rules and things that you should use when you compare it to designing something for lay people, for doing something really simple. And I know that all UIs can be complicated, but there's a lot to even doing a form, but it's very linear. Like you move through everything in linear steps, whereas in creative apps in general, like in drawing apps, in animation apps, everything is non-linear and open-ended. And that presents its own challenges. So there's a lot of research, academic research has been done into the best way to create an environment for creativity to flourish effectively. And there's lots of interesting papers in this area. There's a paper on dips and ceilings, which talks about how users will get up to a certain level in your app, and then they need to transition to a new level, and how their current knowledge doesn't necessarily help them get from say beginner to improver, from improver to intermediate, from intermediate to an advanced user of your products, and it's how you can help bridge that gap for them. And this research is built on another piece of research which talks about, say, intermodal and intramodal workflows. So let's say, for example, a user wants to group some layers. So they go to the file menu and they can hit group. Well, there's actually a faster way to do that. There's a faster way to do that, which is just hitting Command G. There's a shortcut, right? right? So we want to encourage users to use that shortcut. So if a user hits Command G, nothing happens in Cavalry. But if you go to the edit menu and hit group, a message comes up in the message bar saying group, and then in brackets, Command G, just to inform them there's a shortcut that you can use. So we're trying to encourage people to use a faster workflow, basically. And then there are intermodal workflows, which is where you take someone from using Command G or the shortcut, and you'd say transition them to using a hotbox, which is a completely new interaction paradigm. So if you don't know what a hotbox is, it's a radial menu around where the mouse is. So you hit the spacebar in a 3D DCC, and you'll get kind of a bunch of menus around where the mouse is, and then you can just drag in a direction and you get that action, basically. So it's a really fast way of working, because you can just hit a key and drag the mouse and you've got that thing that you wanted. And people work really, really rapidly in that kind of, once they get used to that kind of system. Cavalry doesn't have a hotbox. It's been on the list of things to do for us to do for ages. But that would be transitioning to a kind of even a faster, more advanced way of working. So, and how, as you can see, that being able to use a file menu doesn't help you with being able to use a hotbox, because they're completely different paradigms. And so there's a really interesting challenge when you're designing interfaces about how you get people to go from one to another. I'm not entirely sure yet, but with this is so hard. The intramodal stuff, like a faster way of doing the same thing, we've got that down, I think. But the moving from workflow to workflow, that's really hard in creative apps because of the unended, like, I don't know what you're going to do next, or that kind of thing. So there are other rules, like you need as big a content area as possible when you're using creative software. So a spreadsheet software, the biggest space should be reserved for the cells and things. In creative software, that should be the viewport. And direct manipulation. So doing as much as possible in context, right? So being able to do as much as possible in the viewport, right? So in Cavalry, if you have a gradient, the gradient stops are in the viewport. You double click a gradient stop, you can change the color of it in the viewport. So you don't need to go anywhere else. You don't need to lose your context. You can do it all kind of inline. You can create new stops in the viewport as well if you want to, and things like that. So there's always more to do here, but things like that are also really important when you're creating software for professionals, because you need to keep them in context as much as possible. So there are common mistakes that are made there. So like, if you're using modals, that's usually bad. If you're throwing people into a new view to do something, wizards, that kind of stuff, that's usually bad. Quasi-modals, so things that you can dismiss by clicking outside or hitting escape, they're great usually. So we use popovers a lot in Cavalry. So for our progressive disclosure, we use popovers. So if we have extra settings that are in use sometimes, they're usually behind a button. You hit a button, you get a popover, which is just a little quasi-modal window that appears. You can interact with that, or you can click on it to close it. And so we use quasi-modals over modals as always. And then there's things like a big topic here is interaction complexity versus interface complexity. So what I mean by that is, in professional software, having an empty interface, so an interface with no buttons, with everything behind progressive disclosure and all that kind of thing, can really hamper workflows, right? So you want more buttons in your user interface. You obviously don't want it to look noisy, you don't want it to look bad, but you need the buttons in your interface. And the reason that this is important, there's a great example of this, and this is take a telegraph key. Telegraph key is the simplest interface in the world. It's got one button, right? And then take a keyboard, which has 120 odd keys, and the interaction complexity is like, it's enormously higher than a one button interface. But which one would you rather write a book with, right? You can infer how you use a keyboard by looking at it. If I want an 8, then you hit 8. On a telegraph key, I mean, I don't know how to do 8s, like 3 dots and 3 dashes or something? It's definitely not 8 dots in a row, right? And if you make a mistake, you can't go backwards and all that kind of thing. So it's a simple interface, but it makes the interaction complexity way, way higher. A great example of this that actually makes it kind of underlines how complex this stuff is but mice had 3 buttons before after the Apple Macintosh, where they reduced it to 1. Steve Jobs wanted 1 button, but on the 3-button mouse, the left button was select and the middle button was open. So how do you select something without opening it when you've only got 1 mouse button? Well, Apple invented double click. So you end up with double click, a more complex interaction, a hidden interaction, in order to make the interface simpler. And this, like, some people haven't got over this. The guy who invented Stack Overflow, was it Jeff? I can't remember his name. He wrote a really famous blog post called "Double Click Must Die," and he makes some really good points about why double click's a terrible idea. And so this stuff is nuanced and it's complex, but yeah, you have to be aware that making an interface more complex doesn't make it makes you it doesn't always necessarily mean it's worse, right? So you can have more going on in an interface as long as it's well grouped. You're using your Gestalt principles to keep things together. You're using color a lot. Just being aware of all of that, and then you can make an interface that is instantly intuitive, but not overwhelming. But yeah, a simple interface is usually a bad thing in a pro app, especially when it comes to things like rollovers. Like, I hate it when you roll over a piece of information to declare an interest in it, and that information goes away and is replaced by a menu. Like in Airtable, you've got a row count. Like this table has like 30 rows, and then you put your mouse over it to like as a marker, so you can look at something else and look back. And when you put your mouse over it, it changes to a three dots menu. It's like, well, I needed that information. Why have you done that? There is space for both, you know. So having less is not always better. In fact, it often makes things worse.
Mm. I do find it fascinating in conversations like these, just really bringing to mind how profound a designer's choices in the beginning are. You know, whether it's I've forgotten his name, the guy who wrote JavaScript, and like the decisions he made in the beginning that had these far-reaching that people complain about, or the things that you were talking about, or Apple inventing the double click. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And yeah, you mentioned, I think, design testing, and does that play a role like in avoiding those pitfalls? Have there been areas where you've been very blind to something that has come out in testing?
There's definite mistakes. Yeah. We made I made someone we made a mistake with a usability of a fairly simple feature in Cavalry, and this blip still exists. And the reason that I spotted this blip, and you know, I think I think I've got a solution noted down for it somewhere, but is because we do this design testing, right? So normal design testing you do by heuristic evaluation normally. So you take a set of heuristics like Bruce Tomazzini's or Jacob Nielsen, the guy from the Interaction Foundation. No, it's not the Interaction Foundation. I can't remember where he works. Anyway, or the Gerhard Powells, right? So you take a list of things, which can be things like visibility of system status, and then you look through your app, and then you check that when you do something, that you can see that something's changed, or that the state of whatever's going on is visible. And then if it isn't visible, then you write a defect, right? You create an issue and you say, look, when a user does this, it's not clear that this has happened, or that they're in this state, or whatever, that kind of thing. So you go down this list of heuristics, right, and you log things. So we don't do that in Cavalry. So that's not the way that I test Cavalry. So I take advantage of the fact that we do a conceptual design, and then because we build in terms of concepts, we can test in terms of concepts. So you mentioned a programming language before, JavaScript. Well, someone created, I'm afraid I don't know who, this scheme, this framework for testing anything. Artifacts is what the term that they use, called the cognitive dimensions of notation. So it sounds really complicated. I think it does need simplifying. But basically, this has a set of 14 topics for you to go through to evaluate the usability of something. And it's used for programming languages. So it's used for evaluating, say, the how easy Python is to use, or how easy JavaScript is to use. But it can be used for interfaces, and it's really easy to use for interfaces when you do conceptual design. And the reason for that is because one of the topics, in fact, it's like the most important one, I think, anyway, is the conceptual burden, right? So the conceptual burden is the load on the user when they're using your app. So you can break this down into three distinct areas: the conceptual gradient, which is your learning curve. So, and you can literally plot this, because you can take a workflow like creating a shape in Cavalry or keyframing something, and you can, that's a simple workflow, right? And you can count the number of concepts involved. So in order to do that, you need to know about what a layer is, you need to know what a tool is, you need to know what a keyframe is, right? So you count these concepts that you need, and then you take a more complicated workflow, and then you say how many concepts are involved in here. And usually in Cavalry, there's only a couple more. So whatever you're doing, there's only one or two more things that you need to be aware of, right? So we've got a fairly flat learning curve, which is absolutely fantastic. You have this thing called the conceptual barrier, which is the minimum number of concepts required in order to do something. So that's your kind of like the cliff before the learning curve starts. And that's kind of like the irreducible barrier to entry for your app. And Cavalry's is kind of the same as After Effects here. I think you can't do anything unless you know like 5 or 6 different things, basically. So that would be your getting started video. Your first getting started video is covering those things so that someone can get going. And then you have conceptual management. So copy, paste, drag, drop, rename, instance, create, delete, undo, redo, that kind of stuff. So that's that. And then you just check that you can manage all your concepts in that way. So where we tested Cavalry and where something went wrong is that we have something a little way along our learning curve where there's a spike, where you need to know a lot about something else in order to do what is a relatively simple task. And I only realized this when I went through and I did things, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that's really hard to do, because you need to know about three more things to do this thing. But even when the workflows past that are all much simpler, and so we need to then flatten that curve. So we need to swallow that complexity. The reason that this happened is because something, an internal thing, an engineering thing, leaked into a concept that shouldn't have been there, and that was just a mistake that was made. And we can flatten that out again, and we will. But it's, I only realized that when I was doing this kind of plot. So this is why conceptual design, again, a really good thing to do, because design in terms of concepts, you can test in terms of concepts.
It's so great to hear all this. So I haven't played around with Cavalry enough over the last year or two, year and a half. But when I did a while ago, I went so deep into your documentation, and like now that you're explaining all of this, I can see why I enjoyed that process so much, because it felt, you can go into documentation libraries and it just feels like a list of pages with different information that doesn't really connect. But the kind of like understanding there, oh, there's the thumbs up again. um, that's a design decision that needed to be thought about more carefully.
I've just turned them off.
Yeah, it just felt really understandable, and the way that you're talking about, or we're kind of leading into now the user journey, the learning journey here. Like, it felt unconsciously very well thought out. It felt like principles and blocks of concepts and knowledge. So it's really, really fascinating hearing about this.
Chris, who wrote the documentation, did an absolutely fantastic job. I mean, there's always more you can do. There's always more samples and images. No, but the same for everything, right? It's the same for everything. But yeah, Chris has done an absolutely fantastic job with our documentation, especially pointing out things where we've gone wrong, right? So he'll do the documentation. When he's doing the documentation, he'll say, this is like this on this one, but it's not like this on this one, and that's because we've made a mistake or whatever. And so documentation actually is a really important process when you're writing.
That's great that you can do that. I would love to do that for Glide sometimes. When I used to head up education, now I'm more video and marketing and stuff. And sometimes I wanted to write that, but occasionally it was like, no, we can't say that. Like, need to be a little bit more positive, which I get as well. But yeah, that is really true and interesting. So I want to talk about that learning journey, and you have a lot of sensitivity, it sounds like, to that cognitive load that a new user can have, both through design testing, but also just your orientation towards all of this. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your learning journey as a designer, as a developer, as a motion developer, like when you were really young, and what you struggled with, if you did, and how that might have informed this. And then maybe we can transition to now, like how you see new users coming into Cavalry and how you guide that.
So I'm going to start like really early. So before I was a motion designer, I was a chef, and one of the first things that happened when I used to be given a new recipe to make, you just get the list of ingredients and you get the method underneath, the steps to do. And the first thing I would always do was get a blank piece of paper and draw a flow chart. So this ingredient, and then like a line to something else, and it would be like mix. Okay, so I would draw a flow chart for the recipe. I've always wanted someone to create a flow chart recipe book, but it was more intuitive to me instantly, because the instructions and the thing that I needed were together. So it was instantly more usable for me. And this idea of like blocks, right? It comes up again and again and again. So when I was a motion designer at Mainframe years and years later, I created this thing called MASH, which is a motion graphics tool similar to, I guess you could say, MoGraph or whatever. And that was also built on this idea of blocks, like this kind of discrete chunks of functionality, these big concepts, and you could put those together with those like kind of Lego blocks and then build something using those. And so that's always been through my life. The whole programming aspect is definitely a means to an end. So I was building MASH internally, and I was learning programming while I was doing it, and I wasn't very good at programming. And I opened my big mouth on a forum and said, yeah, text tools in Maya are rubbish. They should work like this. And we got an email from Autodesk saying, put your money where your mouth is. Do you want to build our text tools? And I went into panic mode because I had to do that. So I was speaking to my aunt, and she said to me something like a great piece of advice, maybe the best advice I've ever got, which was, well, I don't know if it's advice. It was a comment. It was basically, she was a bigwig. She was just like a glass ceiling smashing person. She was the second or third female director of a FTSE 100 company. So she's amazing, like really, really just fantastic businesswoman. And she said to me that whenever you start something new, whenever you're moving into a new direction, whenever you're like, you become a company director or a CEO or whatever, just here's the thing. No one knows what they're doing. No one has a clue what they're doing when they start something new. So that's not a reason to not do anything, because otherwise no one would ever advance, right? And so I took the job that I didn't know how to do and then learn on the job, right? Trusted my own ability to learn, basically. And so we did the text tool in Maya, and hopefully it turned out pretty well. After I finished working on it, someone did go in and fix a bunch of bugs that I left. Thank you very much to that person. But learned on the job and just took it on. So, and I learned so much from that, and working on Mash, Maya, Bifrost, all that kind of stuff turned me into a pretty good programmer. So my design chops, I was at university studying interaction, so that's the design stuff follows through, and then the programming has kind of been layered on top. So that's kind of my journey to where I am now.
Fascinating. Yeah. And so there's something in there for me that it makes me think about encouraging play as well, because that was a very encouraging thing that she said. It was like, just go and do stuff. It's okay. Whereas we can go into environments, whether it's like a team or a tool, that kind of tell us unconsciously, like, be careful, which is a very different message. And we give that message to ourselves as well. It's not necessarily from external. As you're designing Cavalry, and as you thought about this in the early days, like you mentioned, the non-linear aspect, people should be able to do anything. But like, there are plenty of non-linear tools that I'll open up and I'll be like, oh my God, I need to go watch a course. Like, I don't want to do anything yet because I could break stuff. Or not break stuff, but like, I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to do anything. Whereas like, there's a kind of a modular thing that we've been talking about here. There's a kind of like, yeah, I'd love you to talk about that and the way that you see it with Cavalry, and whether you think that you're meeting that kind of standard, whether your users are playing enough or whether you could do better.
There are multiple aspects here. So firstly, yes, I think that Cavalry is designed in a way that just affords play, because we keep the rules really simple, right? Like I said about, you want to connect random to something, it's the same random. You don't use a random deform around the random layer for this and a random color thing for that. It's the same, right? So we keep it simple, so you learn it once, you use it many times, right? So that's a thing that helps new users. But the other thing is there's some familiarity here. So we're kind of building on the shoulders of giants in that Cavalry borrows a lot of interface paradigms from After Effects and actually pre-After Effects, a 3D program called the Electric Image Animation System from the late 80s, which it was what's the term, like prototypical timeline interface was invented in that software. So diamond keyframes, a line between them, kind of layers in a hierarchy, the time thumb, all that stuff kind of came from this piece of software, which I think then After Effects took and then built on that idea, because it was big. That software was big at the time. And then I spoke to one of the Electric Image creators years ago, and they said there's no way that After Effects didn't have our app open when they were designing their time. It's just the same, So we've also borrowed from that because it's something that animators are really familiar with, and because it's a brilliant idea. It's a really good idea. Sometimes the best idea is already there, right? So if you can't improve on something, don't just make something different because you want to make something different. Like you can borrow what works, and because that creates familiarity. So you're coming from After Effects to Cavalry, you'll instantly recognize what the toolbar is. You'll instantly know the play stop buttons. Keyframes, diamond. It's the same, right? So we help with familiarity in that way. There are traps. Connections work backwards in Cavalry. Connections work the right way in Cavalry, and they're backwards in After Effects. Stuff like that. But that people need to get used to. But I think there is familiarity because we haven't. It's like, do you remember the piece of 3D software called Bryce? With Kai's Power Tools. Okay, so the interface was mad, absolutely crazy. So, it was just look up, Google an image of this interface, Bryce 3D. It's honestly, it's just insane. There must have been drugs going around that office or something, because it's just crazy. But we don't do stuff like that. We don't change things for the sake of changing things, but we try and make it as playful as possible by keeping everything in this pattern of guided workflows. So you right click on something, you're only shown things that you can do. You can only, if you go right click, add a behavior, we only show the behaviors that you can add at that time. So we like guided workflows like that to help keep people on the rails. But it's just a playful environment. That's the Lego block advantage, right? Because you can just swap that out for this, swap that out for that. It's how it works, and the real time aspect helps with that as well because you can just see your results immediately. There's no waiting for a render or anything like that. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I can't
yeah,
wait till
and
we get there with something like Redshift, like true sort of real 3D renderers. Like
yeah,
that is the pain for me of iterating. And even Wes Cox, famous sort of 3D designer who was on a while ago, like
yeah,
says a
yeah,
similar
yeah,
thing sometimes. Like
yeah. Iterate, adjust. It's the biggest problem, right? Iterate, adjust. That's the thing that takes the time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, 3D is kind of like that now, but I just meant in kind of the render times for stuff. Like sometimes
Yeah,
I want to fully render
yeah,
something out and then see it all in motion rather than looking at
yeah,
viewport versus like the render view.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so just I want to stay on that Bryce sort of tangent there, or not necessarily about Bryce, but like this idea of reinventing visual paradigms. I remember it was a
Mm.
designer or a product designer, posted on X a while ago, and it went a bit viral. It was like a video of like early Xbox game menu interface that was like all green, and instead of like the standard idea of menus or like clicking and stuff like that, you were like just traveling through this 3D world to like choose
Yeah,
options. And it seems a little bit contrived now, but they were trying to like sort of, in my mind at least, reinvent what an interface was. Were there
yeah.
any kind of like wild out there ideas that you thought of in the beginning or think about now about what motion is, especially looking towards, spatial computing and stuff like that were a bit crazy that you threw out or that you would love to do one day?
Yeah, so I'd love to do one day. So again, because I'm pretty obsessed with context, so it's a constant thing that's in my mind, and I'd love to be able to take a shape in the viewport, select a shape in the viewport, hit a key, and for that to explode into all the things that are creating that. So you can, in context, select things, connect things, and all that kind of thing in the viewport. This is a thing that I've really wanted to do, just to make it, yeah, everything in there, just so you don't not searching for layers in a tree and all that kind of stuff, so that you could, yeah, just choose it, see it. So that's the thing that I'd really like to do.
Could you give a really
Um,
simple pared down example of that? Like you mentioned a
yes.
circle or a dot, like what would be inside of a dot or a circle?
Yeah. Okay. So if you have a circle, just literally just a circle, you could hit this key and you would see the material for it, and you would see the shape. And so you could say choose the number of, I don't know, the circle. I guess the radius of the circle or the color of the circle, that kind of thing. You could do it in the viewport just by hitting a key that kind of explodes its settings or core settings or something in an elegant way. And in more complex setups, it could be useful for. Or actually, because in Cavalry, a circle is a primitive, so you can actually just swap it out for a star or a ring or a super ellipse or whatever, just by choosing a different menu option. So being able to iterate through that stuff and doing it in situ, rather than having to locate it in the window, load its settings, change the settings. So yeah, doing it in context is faster. So that is definitely something that I would like to get to in the future. As for things that we've rejected, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I don't know. There are things that we've not tackled because we can't think of a good solution for them. I know that we've had conversations where I thought, but they've solved this so someone else, like, let's do this because this software has it, and you think, I don't think that's an ideal solution for that. Let's wait until we have a better solution. Off the top of my head, I can't think of examples of that. But yeah, I'm sure there are. Yes, I'm afraid I can't think of anything that we've like considered in the past and rejected because it was too outlandish or wild. There are decisions that you have to make when you're designing an animation app. Like, do you have the Figma style panel on one side that has just your hierarchy, and then in the timeline, do you need to drag things in to make them animatable? I think is it Moho Animation does this. So you have basically two hierarchies. You've got what you're animating at the bottom, and then you've got your list of things on the left. Or do you have it all in one? So we've gone for the all-in-one approach, which is what After Effects does. But although we have a hierarchy, so I guess maybe ours is a hybrid between After Effects and a 3D app. And but that means that things that aren't animating are in the timeline, which makes some wasted space in the timeline. But if we didn't waste the space in the timeline, we'd be wasting it by having an extra window for non-animating things. So you would need to then be managing two things. And so there are decisions that you make there, conscious decisions. You say, instead of having two windows, let's have one window, but at the expense of having some wasted space in the time editor. So non-ideal solutions. I know I used to talk to Mark Colleran about this kind of stuff because he used to want to change the way that animation software was built, it would have been a fun project to work with him on that kind of stuff. But yeah, he had some ideas for how we could improve our timeline and things like that, because there are improvements that can be made. But yeah, like I say, can't think of anything off the top of my head that's been rejected. Yeah,
Yeah, I had a quote yesterday. Everything's a trade-off, which sounds negative, but
yeah,
is actually kind of liberating when you
yeah,
think about
yeah,
it
yeah,
deeply.
yeah, yeah.
Um, uh, so a quick question about data-driven. So you can use
Mm,
spreadsheets to power essentially like, the outputs, but you can probably use it to do other things in there. I work at Glide, which is very data-driven, sort of no-code design software tool.
mm-hmm,
And that was very much like the inception. That idea was very much in the inception of it.
mm-hmm.
Was that kind of idea of using a spreadsheet and plugging data-driven stuff into motion there from the beginning?
Yes. So we'd Mainframe, being a motion design studio, had always had a big long list of deliverables for different frame rates and different resolutions and different territories and all sorts, different formats, with alpha, without, just the alpha or whatever. And there are certain projects that had, I mean, must have been hundreds, if not thousands, of deliverables, especially if it was for someone big like Nickelodeon or something.
Yeah, I remember you
And
saying that story in the Joey's
yeah,
podcast.
it was just before my time. It was, in fact, my motion test at Mainframe was to do a Nickelodeon animation. That was my motion test for them when I was being hired there. So that project was live. It was going out the door when I arrived, and that kind of stuff is really painful to do. And we like to, like, it was something that we were very aware of from the beginning, because we'd use things like Templator, which is brilliant in After Effects. I think at the time it was like $100 a month. It's an expensive tool to connect up your animation to some data, and but obviously valuable. Like, you pay for it to do that, right? Because it saves you so much time. So we wanted to build this stuff into Cavalry straight away. So Cavalry has CSV import in the free version, and then even in the pro version you can use Google Sheets, and you can use JavaScript to hook up to whatever APIs you want to. But that was there from the beginning. So the spreadsheet integration was there right from the start, because we like feel that's really important, especially in like today's environment, where custom animations and things are needed online and offline. Yeah, there's been huge projects where tens of thousands of animations have been spit out of Cavalry using that stuff, and that's why we put it in there. That's that idea has been there from the beginning.
Nice. Yeah, there are loads of concepts that I find real parallel to what we do at Glide, or a tool that
Yeah.
allows you to design and ship something online.
Mm-hmm.
The data driven, the kind of modular side of stuff, the scalability. I know you guys are prototyping or playing around with cloud rendering and things like that. There was just a
Mm.
story that you touched on very briefly in Joey's interview about, like, you like seeing how, like, one man bands can deliver huge amounts of content, or like can do things that 5 years ago would have been a studio's work. Is that like a
Yeah.
recurring theme? Is that a really important thing that you see happening with Cavalry?
Yes, it is. And so this is really interesting, and it speaks to the ingenuity, creativity, determination, and just the brilliance of the creative individuals, in that you make there's this Bruce Tognazini, who was an interaction designer at Apple in the 80s. He had this idea that people want a certain level of complexity in their lives, and you in the software that you use, you'll butt up against the limits of what's possible because of the complexity of it. So if you take a piece of software like Cavalry, which makes doing mass renders really easy, people are just going to push it further. They're gonna add things to it. They're going to because they want that complexity, right? They want to get up there and kind of like push against the boundaries, and so yeah, you still kind of reach those limits. And there's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who invented the concept of flow. Like deep work and flow, being in a state of flow. So that kind of explains this idea of people wanting this level of complexity, because they want a challenge. They want a certain level of challenge in what they do. They don't want to be over challenged. Don't want to be under challenged. This is all like stuff that I guess you consider. But yeah, it's all there. I don't. I've forgotten the question. What was the question?
I was kind of just reflecting on the parallels between Cavalry and Glide, and the kind of the power that it gives you to deliver
Yes.
something that
Yeah.
would previously have taken a much larger
Yeah.
organization or
I mean,
team.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then people just take that to the next level, don't they? Yeah, it does. Again, it's the building block approach, like in Glide. The various components and things. Like in Cavalry, we have the various different layer types and things. It is that modular thing which gives you that playfulness, just by putting different things together in different places. It's a really nice way to work in a kind of creative environment.
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, so happy accidents and generative stuff.
Exactly.
Oh, not generative. So that was the mistake I didn't want to make, the procedural stuff. And that was kind of leads into my next question, is the distinction between those two words, procedural versus generative. And we've been talking about procedural stuff, and obviously the whole world of AI and image generation stuff is generative. And we're exploring at the moment with Glide at the moment with like custom components that you can like chat with to develop, that's powered by language models. I'm interested whether, and I was speaking with Isaac Gilley as well, who came on, and he said that they're exploring ideas for shuffle, for generative motion, which is very early days. I'm wondering, because you're vector based, right? Everything's vector based. Is there a world that you're exploring or thinking about even where there is like truly generative motion, or is that there now? Have I just missed it?
No, you're talking about using generative AI to create motion.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have fairly strong feelings on this. So Cavalry. So if you consider the landscape of creative software, a kind of a spectrum from at one end the open-ended stuff like your Cavalry, your After Effects, and at the other end like template websites. I feel like that end is more suited to the generative AI, where you're on Rails basically, and the reason for that is the generative models, the way that they work. In creative environments, statistically they work via regression to the mean. So the stuff that they create is an average, right? And in creativity, when you're working in creativity, your creativity is your moat. It is the thing that it makes you distinct from everyone else. And when you use generative AI to create imagery, animation, that kind of thing, I feel like you're erasing your moat, because what you're doing is you're creating a thing that anyone can do with the same prompt. And so there's a huge amount of nuance to this. So I am being reductive and oversimplifying this, but I do think there's, because Cavalry's open-ended, and yeah, we have experiments with AI and things internally, of course, but my personal opinion is that artists needs to express, right? And Cavalry is a medium for that, like how photography hasn't erased painting, that kind of thing. And so I feel like, yeah, there'll be a place for this kind of open-ended tool. Will we add AI? It's like without doubt, right? Because there are some tasks that are just astonishingly better suited to generative AI. So and actually machine learning in general. So things like green screening or rotoscoping and all that kind of stuff is so good when you put it through these new AI techniques. But as for generative, I think we need another leap to get there with motion. I think that because of the way that this stuff works currently, it kind of does the fun 90% for you, leaving you with a 10% cleanup. So you end up doing the stuff that you don't really want to do. So is it UX Wizard or I can't remember how you pronounce it, but there's this prototyping tool, UX design tool that uses generative AI. So you type in a prompt, it creates you a wireframe, and it creates you a wireframe, but things might be just in the wrong position, or the corner rounding might be wrong, or they've used the wrong font and all that kind of stuff. So it creates you a wireframe, does a lot of work for you, but then you have to spend the time tidying it up because it creates it in this authoring environment, which is great. Hybrid generative authoring environments, amazing. That's the right way to go about it, I think. But yeah, it leaves you with the cleanup work, which for me is the boring stuff. Like, I like doing the creative, expressive work, and then if we can then make an AI that's like tidy this up or make this conform to this like design system, that's brilliant. That's what I want to see. I want to see me placing everything and making it fun and doing the nice bits, and then say, right, conform it to this. That would be great, or like AI kind of like design director agents, where you could say, okay, here's the thing, now make it look like, I don't know, it's got to be someone that's dead, hasn't it? That make it look like this person designed it, because obviously they can't be alive. So ethically very grey area otherwise. So I don't mind that kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of it doing the bulk work for you, I don't know if Cavalry will go for that in the short term. I think we need another leap to make sure that the work coming out is of the highest quality. Because for sure, like if you're producing below average work, AI can really help you. But yeah, I think being at the open-ended, the creative end, where people are expressing themselves, I think that it's more limiting than it is liberating at that end.
Sure.
For now.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And maybe, are you looking at it from like the whole perspective of like generating the whole motion? Because I think where I was thinking was like small sandbox little things as part of your toolkit. Like, is there any technology in the wide spectrum of AI, let's just say new technology that's like built on models or built with models.
I,
Is there any way you
I
can bring
mean,
that in?
yeah, I apologize for over answering your question.
No,
Yeah,
no, no,
so
because
so
you can totally answer it in both ways, and I didn't define it. And I think that's what's interesting about this is like that is such a good reaction from someone who's the CTO of a tool for like pro motion designers. If you were like, yeah,
yeah,
we're gonna let you know, that would be not encouraging. You were thinking really carefully about this. But yeah, there's another question which I could have articulated better, which is like, are there small little
yeah,
ideas, like lab ideas that you're thinking about that you could
yeah.
bring in?
We'd love to be. So there is some cool tool. I think IBM has a really cool tool where you can like prompt to vector design, right? So like I need a like a typewriter as a vector shape, that kind of thing, and it can do that for you. And stuff like that, I think is really cool, really useful for populating ideas out. I mean, even for just for kind of even early stage design or whatever. So something, yeah, that kind of thing, I can definitely see as looking at in the shorter term for sure. As using AI as agents, I like things like renaming layers. Like just reorganizing a scene to make it make sense or more intuitive, or even optimizing things. Because the Cavalry is open-ended creativity, you can build things in lots of different ways, which is important for moving between ability levels. So there's a long way to do something and there's a short way, but it's more complex. You have to provide all of those different ways to do things. And you could like have an agent that could read what someone's intended outcome was and then rebuild their scene in a much more performant way, for example. Stuff like that could
Yeah.
be crazy powerful.
So is there like, with when you copy a load of nodes from a node based thing and then you paste it sometimes into a text editor, you can actually see the way that it's
Yeah.
described or whatever. Is
Mm.
Cavalry similar in that respect, that there's a like, I don't know what you'd call it, but like a scene description that is
Yeah.
easy, whereas like in After Effects that doesn't maybe exist?
Yeah. Yeah, so you can literally just open Cavalry scene files or export them, and you'll see the data. It's all naked. We don't hide anything. Like you can see warts and all exactly how we construct a scene. I mean, I'd like to think that it's pretty elegant what we've put together, but yeah, it's all there for you to see. It's very open in that way, intentionally so. Intentionally so. Yeah. We have we like Cavalry has a CLI, a command line interface, which means that it can run on AWS servers or whatever you want to run it on, and you can kick off renders in that way. And we have people that instead of using our JavaScript APIs, which requires like loading up the app and then changing something, they just go into the save file and they just change a JSON line and then render it out again. So we have people doing that kind of thing for like template websites and all sorts. So yeah, it's you.
Nice. Just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about what you're working on right now and where you're heading over the next year. Like there are some things in development, like the cloud rendering. Are there any other things that you're playing around with, or are there any things that you're playing around with that you don't think's going to become features as well, like sort of lab based?
Yes, yeah. So we're creating. We've got a release at the moment in beta, which has a couple of features in which need kind of a bit of polish. So we've got particles. We've got OpenType, which is in the beta at the moment. So that's things like being able to turn on and off custom ligatures and all that kind of stuff. And we have gradients along a stroke in the beta as well, which is very very tough. I would describe gradients along a stroke as at risk actually, because it's just for quality issues. But I don't like shipping things that are subpar that work most of the time, and so that might go from a beta back into like a tech demo, and then we'll work on that some more before we ship it. But in the medium term, we have this project called Cavalry Control, which Chris touched on in the School of Motion podcast, which basically is our kind of client delivery system. So instead of handing over your kind of a project file with all the kind of layers visible and how you've done things and your kind of your IP and scripts and all that kind of stuff, we want to be able to bundle this up so that you can just send a file and a separate app to a client where they can see a prescribed list of attributes that you've given them access to, like the text, the color, and then they can hit a button to render out. It's based on some settings that you've set, so whatever they need. And you hit that button. So giving client control. So if the client wants deliverables, they can have deliverables, but it's a black box for them. They can't go in and kind of usurp you, replace you. So it's and with zero learning curve. You open it. There's just the things that you need access to, which are kind of evident, and then a button that you use to render. It couldn't be simpler. And you just there's a play button for previewing the animation, and so That's a kind of new client delivery system that we're looking at. It's in private beta at the moment. Hopefully that goes well and we can expand it out. So basically, it's kind of like a bespoke template system, if you will. So that's what's coming in the medium term. And then yeah, further afield, TBD. I need to do some more user interviews to see what's going on. We did about I don't know 40 or something for version 2, and then we're still working through the things that people need adding and all that kind of thing. And so we'll go and talk to our customers again and see what they need next, what problems they're having next. We've had some good user coups. So with people like Apple, Meta, Canva coming on board. Like it'd be good to see, yeah, it'd be good to see what they're doing with Cavalry and how we can help them meet their needs and all that kind of thing. So yeah, there's exciting things happening and always more to do.
Yeah. Yeah. How have you found your, like, in brief, your journey as CTO from the beginning? Like, what's your kind of what's your week routine like in terms of your work and your output? How's that changed since the beginning?
Yeah, so well at the beginning, obviously there've been not many of us. It was just the work. So obviously management creeps into this as you grow in size, and you have to learn how to manage. And um, then yeah, that's a whole different aspect of it. I have like my productive time and no meeting time, so I generally don't do meetings in the morning. It's a basically I'd really rather not. So I usually my first meeting's midday, and then
Yeah.
on after
Well,
that,
thanks for
just
doing
because
this.
that's my yeah, you're welcome. It's usually my most productive time, basically. And then in the afternoon, I can catch up with support requests or like DMs on Discord. We have a really amazing and active Discord community with I don't know 4,500, 5,000 people on there, and it's really really fantastic. And so, but there's a lot of traffic on there and a lot of comments and things, and I get a lot of messages, and so responding to that kind of stuff, and then yeah, just like general admin CTO type stuff, catching up with the founders and all that takes time. It's all brilliant valid activities, but it's not the creating. It's yeah, all outside of that stuff. But yeah, that's been an interesting, relatively smooth journey, I would say. Just because we're not huge yet, I think that if we became much bigger and I had to go off the tools, I would struggle enormously with that. Like, I really like yeah, that I'm still designing and making, and yeah, if we have another year like this year, that might be the case, but we'll have to see.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been fascinating. I love this set of topics. Kind of covered everything that I'm interested in: design, software, emotion. So it's great. Cool. Um,
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
yeah, I'll try and get you on again in a year and see where everything's at. All right. See ya.